I'm Bart Shaw, and I work for a think and action tank called LKMco. We call ourselves a think and action tank because part of what we do is working directly with organisations to evaluate what they're doing, the impact that they're having, and working with them to increase that. And then the other half of what we do is kind of a bit more think tanky, I guess, looking at national policy, education policy, policy that affects young people, and trying to work out solutions to big problems. So it's that second bit that I'm kind of going to talk to you about today. And I'm going to share with you findings, or some findings, from two recently published reports, both for the Social Mobility Commission, kind of fit nicely together and fit into this idea of what are the, how do children progress through school, and then what are their labour market outcomes like at the end of that. So these two reports, similar methodologies. This first one, we we work with Education Data Lab, as we did for both actually. Education Data Lab have access to the National Pupil Database, so we took out a variety of different indicators showing educational attainment right through all the key stages, and we divided that by ethnicity, we divided that by gender, and we divided it by free school meals as a proxy for socioeconomic status. And then we tried to mix the three up. So what did patterns look like, for example, for children from one ethnic group who were male and also eligible for free school meals? And then this second piece of research, again, a similar model of looking at the National Pupil Database. This time we looked at progress between the end of primary school and GCSE. And again, we split the data a variety of ways to try and pick out, well, what are the kind of the nuances behind it. And in both cases, we then added on that added to that quantitative data by going to the literature to try and see what was out there in terms of potential explanations for some of the trends that we were finding. And it was particularly striking with this second piece of work. Some of the research that prompted the Social Mobility Commission to commission us to look more into it was finding some work by Becky Allen, who is the head of Education Data Lab, that showed that for children who were eligible for free school meals, when they finished primary school, so in their Key Stage 2 tests, in their Key Stage 2 assessments, those that are in the highest attaining band at that age, by the time they get to GCSE, have been overtaken by the non-FSM, the pupils who aren't eligible for free school meals, who were in the lowest attaining band at Key Stage 2. So a real stark problem, and one that I hope I can shed a little bit more light on today. So I'm going to kind of talk you through 4 key questions, thinking first about this issue of progress and socioeconomic status, and looking at that in 2 ways. I'm going to show you some data looking at it by ethnicity and looking at it by geography again. Sorry to give you yet more geography, but it is important. And then I'm going to look at the second report and focus in on 2 particular groups and try and show, well, what might be happening once children finish their GCSEs and start to move on to A-levels, higher education, and into the labour market. So this top graph here, I think, shows the extent of the gap in pupils, for pupils from different income backgrounds at secondary school. So the orange, this line here is 0, and above this is progress that is made. You've got the 2 groups, non-FSM and FSM children here, and it's the gap between them. So how much more progress are the children not eligible for free school meals making compared to those who are eligible for free school meals? So right across 4 different ways of measuring it. Their best 8 subjects, their attainment 8 subjects, which at the time were the closest to progress 8 that the government's looking at now. So those are English, maths, science, humanities subject, and then looking at maths and English as well. The gap is pretty stark. But what was surprising is when you looked at the gap in terms of differences between schools, the gap was the relative size of that as an explanation was much smaller. So this was looking at this table, which is quite hard to get your head around, or certainly quite hard for me to get my head around originally. It's showing that if you look at attainment 8, if you evened out all the differences in how children did between different schools, you'd only be left with you'd be left with a much smaller gap. Sorry, the explanation for the gap is much smaller. So only 12% of that gap is caused by differences between schools. So the other 88% is regardless of what school a child goes to, it's that within that school, children who are eligible for free school meals will make less progress than others. And that's right. That's the case right across the country, which means there's kind of two things going on here. One of which are maybe practices that happen in school right across the country. So the practices that don't vary between schools. And then the other thing is factors, and it's really important that John kind of alluded to this before, that it's about the outside world, the world outside of schools, children's families, the areas that they're growing up into, the labour market opportunities they might have, and then how that relates to the progress that they make at school. So we tried to show that there's a bit more nuance than just low-income pupils make less progress and children not eligible for free school meals make more progress. And one way that you can look at that nuance is when you divide it, or when you look at that data by ethnicity. And this is kind of I guess the benchmark. The largest single group is white British pupils. And you can see that for white British pupils, those eligible for free school meals make much less progress. But there seems to be a kind of a protective effect for children from different ethnic minorities, in particular from Chinese and Indian minorities, where even the children who are eligible for free school meals make more progress than this kind of largest group here. Make more progress than those who are not eligible for free school meals, rather, in this largest group here. And so for most ethnic minority groups, that sort of stark free school meals, non-free school meals progress gap doesn't seem to be nearly as important. So I think there's potentially lots that could be learnt from that. And when we looked at the literature, we found a couple of things going on. The first is about people talking about the importance of families' engagement in education, and things like the amount of time and structure that's devoted to homework and leisure pursuits. We also found some interesting literature on migration factors. So for children whose parents are born elsewhere, free school meals might not be the best indicator of socio-economic status. They might be relatively poor in UK terms, but coming from backgrounds where they either had high educational attainment, the parents had high educational attainment themselves, or that their social group was one where they could see if you do well at school, then that can then lead you on to high status, well-paid jobs in future. So maybe two things going on there. But there is still a progress gap. Apart from for Chinese pupils in English, there's still a progress gap between children who are eligible for free school meals and those who are not. So it's important that we don't think that it's the children from low-income backgrounds, from ethnic groups are doing, from different ethnic minority groups, they may be doing better than the white British average, but there's still a gap between them and their more affluent peers within those groups. So we also looked at, or one way that we split the data was by region. So in this top graph, this relates really nicely to what John's been talking about in terms of the difference that's happening in London. So in London, children are making more progress in secondary school than the national average. And outside of London, it's pretty clear to see that they're not. I guess the east of England and the West Midlands doing, I guess, less badly than in other regions. But I think it's important not to, at a kind of regional level, it's important not to read too much into comparisons between them, apart from to show that for London, the difference is so big. So London's getting something right with children from free school meals. And again, the literature's got some interesting things to say about it, that it may be about because there are more children in London with free school meals, that might have an effect. It may be linking back to the data that we showed on ethnicity, that might have an effect. The literature also talks about specific educational policies that have taken place in London. So greater levels of funding historically, and also things like the London Challenge, which have, I guess, provided an impetus for London schools. But again, going back to the conclusion that John rightly quoted from the IFS, it's unlikely to be any single one of those that's made the difference in London. It's, as John says, a kind of the cumulative effect of lots of different things done well. When you look at this graph here, again, I think this is really interesting because it shows London it doesn't follow the same pattern as the rest of the country. So this is the where pupils go to school in terms of the deprivation of the area that school's located in. So pupils who go to schools in really deprived areas are down here, and pupils who go to schools in really affluent areas are over here. This is the progress they make against the national average. So you can see that as you go into more affluent areas, children are making more progress, but it's not quite as stark as that in London. In London, the trend is much less pronounced. So again, something that is important to learn from London, but also it's important to think, right, well, there's a huge amount of pupils in the rest of the country for whom things aren't going so well, and we need to try and put some effort into changing those indicators here. And then finally, this we found interesting, that in urban areas, right across all three types of area, pupils who are eligible for free school meals make less progress than those who aren't eligible for free school meals. But this is much less the case in urban areas compared to rural areas. But also conversely, more affluent pupils do better in rural schools than they do in urban schools. So I think this is an interesting finding, not least because the literature didn't have so much to say about why this might be the case. This is something that maybe is an avenue for further research. There may be some links back to ethnicity, because rural areas are much less likely to have high numbers of pupils from ethnic minorities in them. It may also link to the concentration of children from low-income backgrounds in urban areas, and that schools where there are lots and lots of children who are eligible for free school meals can have maybe different ways of targeting resources at those people, so they can set up the whole school to be to work for the advantage of pupils from the particular needs of pupils from low-income backgrounds, whereas schools kind of somewhere in the middle who've got a few children from low-income backgrounds, maybe it's a trickier balance in terms of how they target their resources. So that's kind of looking right across the country at the progress that pupils make at secondary school. I then wanted to focus in particular on two particular groups and look at their outcomes at Key Stage 5 and then transitioning into the labour market. It's looking at two ethnic minority groups, the first of which is black boys. Now, one of the limitations of our methodology was that we couldn't split for the first study that we did, the one about ethnicity, gender and socioeconomic status, that we couldn't split that group up into Black Caribbean and Black African boys, because we've seen in the literature, and in particular someone called Steve Strand, who's done a lot of work in this area, has shown that educational outcomes vary hugely between those two groups. And if we look back at this graph here, you can see that actually there is a different picture for these two groups. So it's a limitation of our research, unfortunately, that we couldn't break this down further. But we can see that although as a whole, black pupils do better at school than the national average, than the sort of the white British national average, it's not the case so much for boys. So there's a big gender gap, or a bigger gender gap than there is for other ethnic minority groups, particularly at primary school and then secondary school here. So for other ethnic groups, for all ethnic groups, girls are doing better than boys at school. But for other ethnic groups, it's not quite as the difference between the two is not quite as stark as it is for the black ethnic minority group. And that's the case in maths as well. So in fact, it's almost more obvious in maths at a primary school in particular, and then secondary school. So that nuance, I think, is important, because if you're looking at ethnic minority pupils and you're thinking, right, well, they do better than white pupils, we should focus all our attention on white British pupils because they're not doing so well in school, then I think you are at the risk of missing out on some other groups who are in need of support in their education. When you look at A levels, again, this gender gap is much higher than it is for other ethnic minority groups. And then this is looking at the average point score in STEM A levels. So again, those science, technology, engineering, and maths A levels, which we take to be a really good indicator of, or really good sort of facilitating subjects for later labour market success. Again, black boys they're not doing badly, but they're not doing as well as you might expect, given their sort of greater success further down at Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 4. When you compare the white British group and the black group at A-level STEM, in A-level STEM subjects, they're not doing quite as well. And the gender gap, which this is somewhere, unfortunately, girls do less well than boys, is in A-level STEM subjects. The gender gap is much smaller here for this group. So boys outperform girls right across in STEM A-levels, but not so much here. And then in higher education, the picture becomes even more worrying. So we've got, and this I think is the most worrying graph here. This is dropout rates in higher education. Well, I'll let it speak for itself. But this is something that I think universities are aware of, but don't quite yet haven't got to grips yet with why it's happening. And then you've also got the class of the first, your first degree, your undergraduate degree. And again, a problem here. So we're seeing that despite doing better than average at school, it's not translating through to those outcomes that might help graduates into the labour market and then might lead on to later social mobility. And the literature's got a few things to suggest what's happening here. The first is to say that, well, actually maybe it's a cohort effect. Sorry, not this graph. So maybe it's a cohort effect. So black boys at primary, in the early years in primary school are doing much better than in previous generations. So maybe that for that cohort of pupils, that will feed through into later labour market success. Also, particularly for black Caribbean pupils, they're more likely to be on free school meals than other groups. So maybe that's explaining, maybe they're kind of the increased the increased rates of poverty in amongst those groups might be explaining what's going on here. And then finally, a kind of more worrying aspect of the literature, which points out that teacher expectations may be lower for black boys in particular. and that they're more likely to be placed in lower sets when it comes to primary school and secondary school. And again, the literature has got quite a lot to say that on the damaging effect of being placed in lower sets or lower ability groups, both at primary school and secondary school, the damaging effect that has on pupil progress. Now, going back to to some of the explanations for why low-income pupils make less progress at secondary school, that's probably the single strongest school factor that came out of the literature, was that poor pupils are more likely to be placed in lower sets, not just because of their prior ability, but to do with other things such as teachers' kind of unconscious expectations of pupils, or to do with things like behaviour that influence pupils' groupings decisions. So finally, before I finish, looking at one more ethnic group and the transition between success at school and labour market outcomes. And you can see that since 2006, when you compare it to the white British group, Pakistani and Bangladeshi pupils have been making rapid improvement. This top table is looking at overall A levels, so Key Stage 5 average point scores. You can see really strong improvement from 2006 to 2014. And then this is saying that the same improvement is happening for STEM subjects. So you're expecting, this is great news, and you'd be expecting particularly these STEM subjects to be filtering through into success later in life in the labour market. And in particular, pupils who are on free school meals in the British, Pakistani and Bangladeshi groups are doing much better than you would expect. And the same is true for girls as well. So that kind of that gender imbalance at A-level in A-level STEM subjects isn't so much the case. There are more Bangladeshi and Pakistani girls as a proportion opting to take STEM subjects than in the sort of in the largest ethnic group. And in terms of achievement as well, you can see that girls are outperforming boys, both when you look at 2 A-levels or more and 3 A-levels or more. But here's where we found a really worrying finding from our literature review. So a number of different studies looking at the labour market was showing that for this particular group, outcomes were much worse than average. And this is particularly the case for women from Pakistani and Bangladeshi backgrounds. And the literature suggested 3 potential reasons for this, one of which was cultural, and saying that British, Pakistani and Bangladeshi girls were less likely to be making decisions to further their career later in life, although the literature was suggesting that this was that this was changing, that this is potentially old hat and old news and not so much the case anymore. The second reason was talking about, and again in particular for girls, when they leave school and go to university, girls from these ethnic groups are much less likely to move away from home, much more likely to choose a university that's close to home. And the same is true then when accessing the labour market, much less likely to be internal migrants within the country, much more likely to stay close to the parental home. And that has obvious limiting effects, both in terms of university choice, and then as well in terms of being more at risk of just having the local labour market to choose from when it comes to jobs. And then the third and most worrying reason suggested in the literature is about workplace discrimination, and a number of qualitative studies citing the fact that young Bangladeshi women were unlikely to want to go into formal work because they felt that they would be perceived negatively by their employers. And so much higher rates of entry into things like non-formal employment or into kind of very localized ethnic labour markets. So our conclusions from that are pretty worrying. It makes for, I guess, quite depressing reading, in that opportunities in English secondary schools are heavily reduced for children from low-income backgrounds. But that this isn't necessarily so much the case for low-income ethnic minority pupils. So some good news there. Pupils living in urban areas, again, looking at that London effect, and pupils living in less deprived neighbourhoods, making more progress than low-income pupils elsewhere. That particularly for ethnic minority pupils, this doesn't always translate to success later on in life. And that social mobility promise that if you work hard and achieve well at school, that will feed through into kind of later earnings and leading through into good jobs later in life isn't necessarily working for all pupils in our schools. So thank you very much. That's the end of my section of this talk, and I think we're going to take some questions